Michigan having one of its most dominant seasons in school history. But now the real fun begins. The Wolverines facing their first ranked team of the season in Penn State. Alejandro Zuniga and Tyler Donohue here with me to break down this game. Now, if you want playoff or Big Ten chaos, this is the game for you. If Michigan wins, they'll have the same top 10 win as Ohio State, maybe boosting them to number 1 or number 2 in the playoff standings. But if Penn State wins, it would create a three-way tie in the Big Ten East should Michigan beat Ohio State in the regular season finale. Now, before we get started with this preview, let me preface by saying we're looking at this game with the assumption that Jim Harbaugh will be coaching despite the investigations around the Michigan program. So with that being said, let's get started with Michigan's rushing offense led by Blake Corum. Michigan won this matchup last year. At the time, Penn State ranked 5th in the FBS in rush defense, but gave up over 400 rushing yards to the Wolverines. Now Penn State is the top Power 5 run defense in the country. So Alejandro, how does Michigan find success this time around?
Yeah, it's funny to get the national perspective on what Michigan's run game has been this year, because if you asked people around the Michigan football program, it has just not been at quite the same level as that rushing attack that went for 418 yards last year against Penn State. Now, granted, Blake Corum, he leads the nation in rushing touchdowns. Michigan is still a team that likes to run the ball and will absolutely lean on its ground game if it has to. Hasn't quite been at that same level, right? They are averaging under 1 yard per carry, less than they were last. They have 72 fewer rushing attempts. They have 72 fewer rush yards per game than last year. They have just 11 runs of 20 yards or more, not quite at the same level. That being said, Blake Corum was a Heisman candidate last year for a reason. This is an offensive line that returns several starters from lines that won the Joe Moore Award 2 years in a row as the nation's best. And with Blake Corum, Donovan Edwards, and a great third down back in Khalil Mullings, you do expect that Michigan's going to pull out some wrinkles, incorporate J.J. McCarthy, and attack the ground game in ways that maybe they haven't so far this year.
That was a very dark day for the Penn State defense in Ann Arbor last October. It was one that led them to come back to campus, regroup, look in the mirror, have some difficult conversations, and to their credit, led by defensive coordinator Manny Diaz, they've been as buttoned up, I think, defensively as anyone across the country since that game. You look at what happened against Ohio State a couple weeks ago. That was not on the defense. They played really well. They forced a lot of punts. They forced a lot of quick possessions from the Buckeyes, which you don't see often in Columbus. They gave their team a chance. The offense let them down. But here is their biggest test thus far, because this game is what has been brought up time and time again about the front of this defense. Can you stand up against a Michigan offense that ran it down your throat for 400-plus yards last year and embarrassed you in a national showcase matchup? And James Franklin expressed a lot of confidence in that this Tuesday during his press conference, discussing the bigger guys they have in the defensive tackle position. They have a lot of returners, but they concentrated during the offseason with motivation from the Michigan game to add weight to these guys. And they have gone from 285-pounders to 295, 300-pounders across the board. They only lost a couple defensive linemen from their 2022 defense. They were both undrafted free agents to the NFL, and they've got a lot of rising talent. The big question here is, does Chop Robinson return at the defensive end position? He's one of their standouts. He has missed the last couple games after exiting early against Ohio State. And then at the linebacker spot, that was another area that got exposed against Michigan last year. Far more experienced there than they were this time last season. They've got better depth. So it feels like they are better equipped to take on this Michigan defense or Michigan rushing attack. But for this defense, it's going to be prove it for 60 minutes of football in Beaver Stadium.
Drew Aller has been significantly better at home than on the road. Good news for him here. He's home. But we all know the questions the passing offense have faced all season long. So, Tyler, how effective does Penn State's passing game need to be in order to keep this offense balanced against the best defense in the country?
Yeah, there was a rough two-game stretch there, Ohio State and then back home against Indiana. They had to rely on a late bomb from Drew Aller to Keandre Lambert-Smith to survive a scare from the Hoosiers in Beaver Stadium. But they found something in that moment. That was right after Drew Aller threw his first interception of the season of his career. He had the longest NCAA streak ever to start a career without throwing an interception. That came to an end late against Indiana. On the very next possession, he responds with a game-winning touchdown pass, which you see right there in the video. And then he comes up with a huge performance on the road against Maryland. In 3 previous road starts, 2 total touchdowns, 48% completion. This time, last Saturday, he goes 75% completion against the Terps, throws 4 touchdowns. So he's got 23 total touchdowns, 1 interception on the year. One thing we thought he'd be able to rely on was a ground game, and I think that's where the balance comes in. Nick Singleton has not been the scintillating fireworks show that he was as a freshman when he was the Big Ten's top freshman of the year. Only one run longer than 20 yards this season. It's kind of crazy to think about, but Katron Allen has been the tone setter for them on the ground of late. He went for 90 yards last week. That was a high against Big Ten opponents this year. You're still going to see Nick Singleton involved, but I'm curious, do they go with the hot hand? Give it to Katron Allen, because they didn't get to really establish the run game last year in Ann Arbor, and the game got away from them in a hurry. I think with a first-year starter, even on home turf, they cannot afford to get one-dimensional against this Michigan team because they just don't seem to have the perimeter talent thus far in a 9-game track record to live and to live that way and come out with a win.
Now, from Michigan's perspective, it's been all about making offenses one-dimensional, right? And for Michigan, it all starts in the defensive interior. They have several outstanding defensive tackles, starting with Chris Jenkins, NFL son of an NFL veteran, will be in the NFL next year. Mason Graham, another sophomore outstanding defensive tackle, he'll be in the NFL soon. Surrounded by a variety of edge rushers, depth at the linebacker position, and then a secondary that had a lot of question marks coming into the year, some injuries, some depth issues, and let's face it, they haven't really been tested at the level that they're going to be tested by such a balanced and talented offense as Penn State's. There were questions about who was going to be the second corner coming into this year. Josh Wallace, a UMass transfer, has taken that role with aplomb, but he left the last game against Purdue injured. Michigan does expect him back, but we'll see how he's able to perform. All that being said, this is a defense that has not faced a single snap inside their own 10-yard line all year. I don't quite expect that to continue against Penn State because Michigan has not faced an offense, again, with that much talent of that caliber, but it's an offense, or excuse me, it's a defense, a Michigan defense that is absolutely one of the best in the country.
Let's talk about the quarterback on the other side, J.J. McCarthy. He actually just passed a pretty cool milestone. He passed Tom Brady for 9th on Michigan's all-time passing yards list and only needs 81 more yards to pass his head coach, Jim Harbaugh, for 8th in school history. Alejandro, what makes McCarthy such a special athlete who can change these games so quickly?
Hey, 5-star is going to 5-star, right? J.J. McCarthy was a 5-star prospect, one of the best in the country, and he's now in his 3rd year with the program, 2nd year as a full-time starter. And when you're looking at what J.J. McCarthy has this year that maybe he didn't quite last year. Last year, J.J. came in as the backup. People forget that. He was the backup to start the 2022 season. He was injured throughout the entire summer in 2022. This year, it is his team, and he is playing like it. I mentioned the run game hasn't been necessarily what Michigan has wanted throughout this year. They have been able to lean on J.J. McCarthy throughout the season. He is a Heisman Trophy candidate for a reason. He can beat you with his arm. He can beat you with his leg. He is very intelligent, and he is an outstanding leader and individual on and off the field. Jim Harbaugh has said many times that he recommends anyone on the Michigan football team follow J.J. McCarthy to hell and back if needed, and that may be the case this weekend, that they need to follow him and lean on him in State College.
This is the most star power on the other side of the field that Penn State has dealt with through 10 games now, but they have their own star power defensively. I don't think J.J. McCarthy has seen a defensive unit like this since last season. He's got the experience, but this is a relatively untested offense late into games. So I'm curious what that may look like when this game's hanging in the balance deep into the fourth quarter. But with J.J. McCarthy, I think they've got to get him unsettled. He is so in sync right now running this offense as the orchestrator, the facilitator of Michigan's attack. You can't let him play that way in Beaver Stadium. And this defense has the pieces off the edge. I mentioned Chop Robinson before. If he gets back for this game, and we'll see. We're going to get a look at practice this week. But if he can get back, he is a premier edge rusher, a potential first-round pick. So that changes things. They've got Adiza Isaac, a senior, who's has 6.5 sacks. I believe that's second in the conference right now. He has 4 in the last 4 games. And then a former 5-star in Dennis Sutton. So they have this really impressive elite trio at defensive end. Abdul Carter is the guy I'm spotlighting here, though. From the second level, can he wreak some havoc? It was a big calling card of his as an All-American freshman linebacker last year. He had 6.5 sacks. Just 2 sacks this season thus far. He had 1 to close out the first quarter last week against Maryland. Can he pick it up? Can he inflict some damage? And then Kalen King, he talked to us today, preseason All-American at cornerback, has stepped into that Joey Porter Jr. #1 alpha role in this defensive backfield. But he had a rough game against Ohio State. He actually told us it may have been the worst game of his career. Marvin Harrison Jr. is a tough matchup, but I think he wants to atone for some of that under the bright lights. I know it's a noon kickoff, but this has bright lights when Michigan comes to town.
All right, toughest test of the season for both teams here. So, Tyler, what's the key to a win?
I think in trenches. It has been the problem for Penn State in this matchup the last couple of years. You look back at 2021, a very tightly contested game that went down to the wire. Sean Clifford, the quarterback, was sacked 7 times that day. You look at last year's matchup. We already talked about 418 yards on the ground against you defensively, but the Penn State ground game could not muster anything, couldn't find any offensive balance. So both sides of the football, that's at the forefront. I think this offensive line, we're still waiting. This is the ultimate litmus test thus far. They did not necessarily show up in the way we expected them to against Ohio State, but they were a little bit shorthanded that day. They've got more depth at this point in the season. They've got more depth than they've had at any point in any season that I recall on the offensive line. And I think the defensive line depth has been proven to this point. So I would say I'm more confident in Penn State holding the end of the bargain on the defensive side of the trenches. What has me more concerned about Penn State in this matchup and their ground game and Drew Aller's security is that offensive front against Michigan's defensive front.
The trenches have absolutely been an area that Michigan has hung its hat on for the last couple of years as they've won the Big Ten title 2 years running. For me, when I'm looking at this game, I'm looking at the 2 players that Michigan feels like it's had mismatches in every single game. One of them is Donovan Edwards, the running back who is an outstanding pass catcher out of the backfield. He split out wide last week against Purdue. They brought a linebacker over to cover him, and there was just no shot. If Michigan uses him in that capacity, Penn State has excellent linebackers to a level that Michigan hasn't quite seen this year, but I do have faith that they will be able to move the ball with Donovan Edwards on a linebacker if need be. Same thing with Colston Loveland, 6'5", 240, a tight end who runs routes like a wide receiver, can catch the ball like a wide receiver. Michigan has excellent tight end depth both in Colston Loveland and A.J. Barner, the Indiana transfer. Guys that Michigan has been able to lean on, and in a game that I expect the trenches are going to be a battle, I expect those 2 skill position players for Michigan to potentially make a difference in this game.
Alejandro and Tyler, thanks so much and enjoy the game. And for more on this matchup, be sure to check out Lions 24/7 and the Michigan Insider for your Penn State and Michigan football and recruiting news all year long.